going to get started here in just a minute. My name is Roger Levine. I'm a member of the history department. I think it's important. It's great to see so many new. I've been away for basically a year and a half on various types of leaves. So the thing that's been terrific about being here today is just to see so many new faces. And I thought it was important for us to introduce ourselves too. So I'm in the history department, but I teach in humanities and environmental studies and in IGS. So I think this is a great conference to bring all those things together. We're going to try and carve out a little bit of time for each of us. So we're going to try and keep our speakers to 15 minutes. Now here's Melody to introduce the speakers.
Hi, I'm Melody Crowdermeyer. I'm in politics and women's and gender studies, and we'll be hearing from several of my colleagues in those fields today. So we'll be hearing first from Russell Fielding and Matthew Mitchell from environmental studies and history and other interdisciplinary activities. We'll be hearing from Adam Dahl in politics and from Tam Parker in religious studies. So as Roger said, we'll wave our bodies around as you start to get close to 15 minutes. But don't be scared, we'll keep them in our chairs. So, all right, go ahead and Russell and then get started.
Well, thanks to all of you for your attendance here. Thanks to the Mellon Globalization Forum for giving us the money to start developing this course that Russell and I are about to teach, this team-taught course on the geography and the environment of North American slavery in a comparative sense and a sort of systemic sense. And thanks also to the organizers of this forum of this conference for giving us a chance to, well, inviting us to this, giving us a chance to kind of think through this topic that we're going to teach on in a new sort of way for us, a different sort of way, and really to engage with what turn out to be many, many instances of body discourse in the current literature on the history of slavery. For instance, in his modern classic essay, Between the World and Me, the journalist and MacArthur Fellow Ta-Nehisi Coates writes movingly of North American slavery as the plunder of black bodies. At the onset of the Civil War, he notes, our stolen bodies were worth $4 billion, more than all of American industry, all of American railroads, workshops, and factories combined. And the prime product rendered by our stolen bodies, cotton, was America's primary export. The richest men in America lived in the Mississippi River Valley, and they made their riches off our stolen bodies. Cotton does not stand alone as a product of this plunder. In different areas of the continent, and at different points in time, says Coates, enslavers, quote, transfigured our very bodies into sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gold. Historians have also in recent years employed this language of slavery as plunder of black bodies to significant effect. Of the profits that slave traders gained by the forced movement of enslaved Africans from the Atlantic seaboard to the new cotton states in the early 19th century, Walter Johnson writes, quote, the slaves in whose body that money congealed as it moved south had to be transported, housed, clothed, fed, and cared for during the 1 to 3 months it took to sell them. Calvin Schermerhorn focuses on the process by which enslaved black bodies were converted to entries on a plantation ledger book, parcels of the wealth of slave traders, and even to the basis for financial instruments, such as mortgages and insurance policies. By these means, planters and slave traders, quote, commoditized their bodies, but did not colonize their consciousness, end quote, due to the efforts of the slaves themselves at mental and spiritual resistance. Most ambitiously of all, historians including Schermerhorn and Edward Baptist employ the human body as a metaphor for the entire system of North American slavery, with its specialized regions resembling the organs of the body. Baptist pushes the metaphor farthest in his controversial 2014 book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. Borrowing from Ralph Ellison, Baptist suggests that, quote, we view the whole of American life as a drama enacted on the body of a Negro giant who, lying trussed up like Gulliver, forms the stage and the scene upon which and within which the action unfolds. Baptist alters this image of Ellison somewhat, replacing Ellison's bound and stationary giant with a giant that grew and moved, in keeping with the growth of the geographic expanse of slavery and the forced movement of slaves by the hundreds and by the thousands to populate and bring forth new wealth from these virgin lands. For his part, Schermerhorn writes of the transatlantic circulatory system through which, quote, merchants and bankers in cities like Liverpool, London, and New York pumped money, manufactures, and processed goods into commercial arteries, while in cities like Baltimore and New Orleans, merchants pumped in slaves as well, end quote. Schermerhorn, moreover, challenges us here in Sewanee to make our reckoning with our distant past as an appendage of this giant. Towards the close of his chapter on the firm of Franklin and Armfield, foremost slave relocators of the decade of the 1830s, Schermerhorn notes that one of the principals, John Armfield, built himself a home and resort at Beersheba Springs in Grundy County, and, quote, was a principal benefactor of the University of the South. A brief primer on the historic and geographic sweep of African slavery in the Western Hemisphere is in order here. The Spanish first introduced enslaved black bodies to the Caribbean region in 1502, a mere 10 years after Columbus's first voyage of discovery. And for the next 3 centuries, Africans would supplement the dwindling Native American population in the forced labor regime of Spanish America, including the silver mines of Peru and Mexico that were the main source of Spanish wealth during that nation's 16th century golden age. In the 1580s, the Portuguese began the first American experiment with enslaved labor on sugar plantations in their colony of Brazil. And that land took in some 4 million enslaved Africans over the course of the growing transatlantic slave trade. The Dutch, English, and French followed suit with the Portuguese. As they took possession of various Caribbean islands in the 1600s, they erected sugar plantation complexes. During the 1700s, the sugar produced on British islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and St. Kitts became a significant portion of the diet of Britons regardless of socioeconomic class. While the French possession of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, was by many measures the most prosperous stretch of land anywhere on the planet. An offshoot region in the southern part of Britain's mainland colonies employed enslaved Africans to produce rice and indigo in the South Carolina Low Country and tobacco around the Chesapeake Bay region. Already by this point, before the late 18th century wars of independence, the empire of slavery exhibited important geographical distinctions. Planters in the southern colonies and Caribbean, in a position to monopolize decision-making power over land and laborers, almost utterly neglected subsistence crops in favor of cash crops such as coffee, cotton, and above all sugar. The more northerly colonial regions such as Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts initially fell into the role of a hinterland to the plantation region, providing basic goods such as flour and dried fish for the diet of enslaved and enslavers alike. Increasingly, though, those same northerly regions began their industrial advance by processing one byproduct of the sugar plantation complex, molasses, into rum. In fact, attempts in the 1760s by New England distillers to purchase cheaper molasses illegally from French Saint-Domingue rather than British Jamaica played their role in the crisis that led to the independence of both the United States and of Haiti. These events, combined with the end of the British transatlantic slave trade in 1807, and despite the end of the United States transatlantic slave trade the following year, moved the epicenter of the North American plantation complex from the Caribbean, where it had been, to the southern United States, which was growing westward, of course, at the time. An important and tragic demographic fact underlay this shift. In the tropical regions, with their hotter climate and disease environment, the bodies of slaves tended not to live long enough to reproduce, and new African bodies had to be brought in constantly to replace those that had been used up. Slave populations in mainland North America, however, did naturally increase. Though this might have seemed to be at least a small mercy to those enslaved in mainland North America as opposed to the Caribbean, it actually set up a different horror. As the United States expanded westward across the continent into areas ideal for growing the cotton that was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, slave populations in the tapped-out soil of the old colonial regions had to be moved westward into the new areas. Countless enslaved families were forcibly parted, never to be reunited, as the ensuing interstate slave trade uprooted the bodies of over 1 million individual African Americans to be transplanted to southwestern soil. In the second North American plantation complex, upland areas, including eastern and middle Tennessee, took on the role of hinterland, using slave labor to produce such basic goods as grain and coal in order to supply the cash crop regions. England, New England, and New York, meanwhile, served as both the ultimate source of the finance capital that purchased land and slaves, and as the ultimate destinations for the cotton they grew. Since land, along with enslaved black bodies, was the other ingredient in the mix that produced profit for enslaving entrepreneurs, I'd like to invite my colleague, Russell Fielding, to offer some comments from the point of view of the environmental studies discipline, as well as to give some particulars of the class that we will soon be teaching on this subject.
Thanks, Matthew. The plunder of New World landscapes was neither worse than nor separate from the plunder of black bodies that made this agriculture and demographic transformation possible. Rather, the two processes shared both chronology and motivation. Their histories are intertwined. Environmental author and friend of Swanee, Wendell Berry, rightly stated that there is in fact no distinction between the fate of the land and the fate of the people. When one is abused, the other suffers. The environmentally degrading practices of plantation agriculture went hand in hand with the human degradation that was slavery. The fact that neither the land nor the people were, quote, pristine before the exploitation matters little to the outcome of our evaluation of slave-based plantation agriculture, except that these facts, acknowledged by the Academy embarrassingly recently, have been used by apologists of slavery and other forms of human exploitation on the one hand, and on the other, of processes resulting in environmental degradation. In 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage to the so-called New World, geographer William Denevan revealed and simultaneously burst the pristine myth. He was the original mythbuster. A persistent belief among scholars and the public alike that the Western Hemisphere was, prior to the arrival of European settlers, a terrestrial paradise, quote, beautiful and fertile and green, teeming with birds, with naked people living there called Indians. According to Denevan, the pristine myth would have us believe descriptions of the mid-20th century author, or like those of the mid-20th century author John Bakeless, which held that there were not very many of these so-called Indians, and they lived in a land that, quote, seemed empty to invaders who came from settled Europe. The ancient, primeval, undisturbed wilderness, the stream simply boiled with fish, so much game, 1,000 animals near a salt lick in Virginia, the forested glory of primitive America. Similarly, in terms of human history, scholars such as Eric Wolf and Edward Said have dismantled the once dominant view that before contact with Europeans, the majority of cultural groups on the planet represented people without history. In contrast to the myth of a pristine new world and the prejudices institutionalized by Orientalism and other Eurocentric ideologies, the landscapes of America and the bodies of Africans being enslaved were real, working, and humanized, despite or perhaps because of their as yet limited contact with European cultural and economic systems. Denevan speaks of the modified forests of pre-contact Eastern North America, transformed through clearing and burning, the Terra Preta do Indio, or anthropogenic black soil in Brazil and the rest of the Amazon, and the terraces, irrigation walls, raised fields, sunken fields, etc., built throughout the agricultural lands of pre-contact North America. Not all landscape modifications were agricultural. Urban built environments range from the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde to the cities of Tenochtitlan and Cahokia, the latter of which was the largest city in North America until New York surpassed it in 1775, despite the fact that it had been abandoned long before Columbus and his followers arrived. A humanized landscape is one that has been transformed to meet the needs of its human inhabitants. Both a landscape and a people can become dehumanized as each is degraded to the point of inability to meet the needs of its inhabitants or self. The American landscape, in response to the rapid depopulation of native peoples that followed the arrival of Europeans, along with their diseases, weapons, and manifest destiny, reverted to a condition that appeared less humanized, more of Longfellow's forest primeval than of the working agricultural and urbanized systems of the Inca, Maya, and other native cultures. Because disease and the avant-garde of European militaries moved faster than settlers, by the time people came to stay, they encountered a landscape that had been both depopulated and dehumanized. Likewise, the peoples of Western Africa, whose bodies would be commoditized by the Atlantic slave trade, comprised real, living, humanized human cultures. From the libraries of Timbuktu to the linguistic dominance of Bantu-descended peoples throughout the African continent, the complex cultures that developed, declined, developed again, and evolved in that region alongside, and during trans-Saharan, Roman, and later European contact show rich, deep, and independent cultures and histories. Still, the humanity of the American landscape and of the African body escape notice, willfully or otherwise, of the many who would exploit them. Apologists of both processes, the process that converted the depopulated landscapes of North America into monocrop plantations and the process that plundered African bodies into slave labor, share a common argument. They say their actions were intended to bring order into chaos. Their sins, both environmental and misanthropic, sought justification in light of the process of salvation they set into motion. George Perkins Marsh, a 19th century progenitor of today's environmental sciences, noted that the forest does not furnish food for man, and thus must be transformed to become useful and humanized. That these landscapes had already been humanized by Native Americans for centuries, only to be rapidly dehumanized following contact with Europeans, was a fact concealed by belief in the pristine myth. Similarly, a dominant theme in the apologetics of slavery has been the civilizing effect that the imposition of European and later American culture would have upon the enslaved. The idea persists even today, sometimes in unexpected places. For example, Keith Richburg, an African-American journalist, reflecting in general on his years as a Washington Post correspondent in East Africa, and specifically on a moment in northern Tanzania as he stood by a river in 1990 watching a, quote, a body or two every minute float downstream, bloated, discolored, and dead, victims of the genocide in Rwanda that borders Tanzania to the north, writes that, this is a long quote, "I thought about how if things had been different, I might have been one of them, or might have met some similarly anonymous fate in one of the countless ongoing civil wars or tribal clashes on this brutal continent. And so I thank God that my ancestors survived that voyage." Does this sound shocking? Does it sound almost like a justification for the terrible crime of slavery? Does it sound like a black man who has forgotten his African roots? Of course it does. All that and more. Richburg acknowledges the equally brutal experience that the fate of those enslaved Africans, including his ancestor who survived that voyage, experienced, but still maintains his mantra, quote, "Thank God my ancestor got out, because now I am not one of them. Thank God I'm an American." We seek, Matthew and I seek in our class, to teach students that some things are connected and others need not be. Through seminar readings and site visits to the landscapes of slavery in southern Appalachia, the Deep South, near New Orleans, and the Caribbean, our students will experience the human and environmental history firsthand. Our class will emphasize the direct link between the experiences of land and people, land and bodies, the intrinsically connected abuse and suffering of both people and the natural environment. Our class will divorce, however, Richburg's notions of thankfulness and pride from a belief in the inevitability of long-range beneficence of the Atlantic slave trade and its associated denigration of black bodies and land. Order and humanization need not occur at such a human and environmental cost. We hope to get that point across during the semester and a half of studies. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks to the organizers and thanks to everybody for coming. To start out, I just want to say a little bit about where this paper came from. When I got the call for papers last November or so about the Bodies Conference here at Sewanee, I was really excited that this was happening and thought it was a great idea, but I also was a little frustrated that I didn't have any ideas for a paper to submit. So I actually ended up submitting this abstract somewhat later because I started to think about some debates surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement, and specifically the language of the black body and black bodies, which is not without controversy. Some have expressed concern that this language of the black body actually potentially dehumanizes the victims of racial violence, right? To say that what's at stake here is just sort of physical harm, that this potentially downplays the mental, spiritual, and emotional anguish of racism. So people have suggested that we should be talking about violence inflicted on black people or black personhood rather than the black body. So the basic point here, right, is that the language of the black body denies the mental and spiritual being beneath the body. So as I was thinking about this more, I had also previously read Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent work, Between the World and Me, which if you've read it before, you'll notice is continually marked by the language of the body. I think there was, if you do a Google search, I think the variation of the black body or black bodies appears 140 some times in it. So I want to use Coates' work as a way of exploring the literary language of the black body and try to foreground the specific philosophical, moral, and political work that language and that concept is doing. And I'd ultimately like to argue that Coates's book provides a deep theoretical reflection on the moral and political problem of what he calls black disembodiment as a condition of domination and a lack of freedom in the age of Ferguson. So I'll walk through just a few sections, a few different sets of reflections here. And the first of these is entitled Sanguino Ergo Sum. I bleed, therefore I am, with apologies to classicists in the room. Son, last Sunday the host of a popular news show asked me what it meant to lose my body. So begins Coates's work Between the World and Me. He's drawing here, as some of us might know, on a literary device that is taken from James Baldwin's prefatory letter, My Dungeon Shook, which provides actually the preface more or less to his larger work, The Fire Next Time. And Baldwin's letter is ultimately addressed to his nephew about his place and his position in white America. Coates likewise also addresses his rich exploration about the prospects of African American freedom to his son, Samori. From this opening salvo, Coates foregrounds disembodiment, that is the loss of the body, as the central issue of black politics and identity in the age of Ferguson. What's striking about the work is that Coates refuses to offer solace and comfort to his son. Instead, he advises him on how to, quote, live free in this black body. In Coates's hand, black disembodiment, the loss of the body, is a particular kind of unfreedom, of domination. Black disembodiment for him is a historical condition that deeply defines not just African American identity, but the identity of the American nation as a whole. Coates writes, quote, as for now, it must be said that the process of washing the disparate tribes white, the elevation of their belief in being white, was achieved not through wine tastings and ice cream socials, but rather through the pillaging of life, labor, and land, through the flaying of backs, the chaining of limbs, the rape of mothers, the sale of children, and other various acts meant, first and foremost, to deny you and me the right to secure and govern our bodies. What's striking here is how he groups such different forms of violence under the heading of black disembodiment, or what he calls plunder. And in doing so, he establishes a striking continuity between the Atlantic slave trade, the plantation economy, the convict leasing system, penal labor, hyper-incarceration, what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, lynching, stop and frisk, and contemporary police brutality. Although slavery is the archetype of plunder, its basic logic extends through history from the slave auctions of New Orleans to the police departments of New York. The language of the body here employed by Coates does a remarkable job of conveying the horrific experience of racial violence. In The Body and Pain, the literary theorist Elaine Scarry famously explored the difficulty of expressing and perceiving the experience of physical pain. Physical pain, Scarry writes, has no voice. Although violence itself scars the epidermal layer of the physical body, the experience of pain, according to Scarry, emerges from a subterranean level, which he calls an invisible geography that is not immediately perceptible on the surface of human experience. Human pain is inexpressible. It resides in a realm where, as Virginia Woolf put it, language at once runs dry. But what Scarry fails to note is that the distribution of empathy with the body and pain is determined by racialized structures of power. More precisely, public discourses of black masculinity and the mythology of black culture prevent a shared sense of suffering from arising. And this, I would argue, is due to the dominance of liberal discourses in America. Specifically, liberal citizens, for instance, throughout American history have defined freedom through possession of the body, through bodily security and bodily integrity. And at the same time, they've constructed this understanding of freedom in opposition to the way in which women and African Americans were denied freedom and equality, precisely due to the lack of control they exhibited over their body, that is, through policies like coverture and racial slavery. The question that Coates grapples with then here is how to make the pain of the racial other visible in public discourse. That is, how to express in the dry well of language the racial body and pain. Racism for Coates is more than a matter of injustice, moral depravity, or dehumanizing rhetoric. It is first and foremost what he calls, quote, a visceral experience that dislodges brains blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. Coates thus responds to the problem of the black body and pain by inventing languages that, in Scarry's words, will, quote, reach and accommodate this area of experience so normally inaccessible to language. Now, what I'd like to add here is that this inaccessibility is posed not by the inadequacy of language per se, but rather by the failure of the ethical grammar of liberalism to register racially determined experiences of black pain as a moral and political problem in the first place. The second section here is the philosophy of the disembodied. In Volume 2 of Democracy in America, first published in 1840, Alexis de Tocqueville famously argued that Americans are great disciples of René Descartes without even knowing it. He says, quote, "America is therefore the one country in the world where the precepts of Descartes are least studied and best followed." What he was getting at here was that, of course, right, this is the anti-intellectualism of Americanism, but the immense practicality of their mindset. But what he was getting at here was the primacy of individual judgment, the way Americans invested the human mind and human rationality with an almost sovereign status. So in this way, for Tocqueville, liberal subjectivity in America was fundamentally defined by this Cartesian, abstract individual who exists as a pure disembodied mind. And in doing so, they exercise rational control over the world, right? Descartes' idea was that, when he's saying, "I think, therefore I am," right? Is that I don't know that my body exists. I don't know that the physical world around me exists, but by the very fact of thinking, I do know my mind exists, right? And so my mind has a superior, almost moral and intellectual status over my body. And this becomes the basis for liberal conceptions of freedom, right? To be free is to have sovereign and rational control over yourself and over the world. In the words of Charles Taylor, this Cartesian notion of disembodied reason requires that we disengage ourselves from our ordinary embodied way of experiencing. So for liberalism and for Cartesian understandings of rationality, the embodied self, that is bodily experiences, actually are a source of doubt. They're something that must be overcome and must be ultimately eliminated if one is to establish truth in the first place. Coates rejects the mind-body dualism, and in doing so, he shows how the embodied experience of racial violence can be a unique source of political and moral truth. We see this when he tells his son Samori that black people love their children with a kind of obsession. "You are all we have, and you come to us endangered. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed by the streets that America made." That is a philosophy of the disembodied. The reference here to parents who would sooner kill their children than see them killed by the various iterations of American white supremacy unmistakably echoes the story of Margaret Garner, which was beautifully but hauntingly portrayed in Toni Morrison's Beloved. The story of Margaret Garner, of course, is that upon realizing that she and her children would be resold back into slavery after a failed attempt at escape, actually kills her own daughter. Try teaching this to students. It's really difficult. But the point here that I think this idea of the philosophy of the disembodied, what it gets at is that this philosophy does not proceed from abstract notions of morality, right? Where we have universal conceptions of morality that can be applied in any and all situation. And it also shows us that the implications of our actions can't be controlled by moral intention, right? The philosophy of the disembodied then requires morally ambivalent actions in order to live within a fractured world marked by the vulnerability of life to the arbitrary powers of white supremacy. So Coates' language here actually points toward a profound philosophical disagreement with the basis of moral liberalism, and that's the idea of the morally autonomous, rational subject as the basis of democratic politics. And we see this rejection of this mind-body dualism when Coates writes, "I believed and still do that our bodies are ourselves, that my soul is the voltage conducted through neurons and nerves, and that my spirit is my flesh." The third and last section is freedom as a verb. I think the question then that I ask from this is, what kind of freedom does Coates seek, and how should we rethink the basis of freedom? The philosophy of the disembodied challenges, I think, two things here. One is that it challenges this kind of American liberal conception of freedom, right, that involves sovereign, rational mastery over one's life and over the world, right, the idea that you get to do what you want in some way. But it also actually challenges black radical thinking that locates freedom first and foremost in the realm of the mind, the spiritual realm. Freedom for Coates is not simply, however, a problem of mental degradation and psychological despotism. It is at root a problem of the body. And he writes, and so enslavement must be casual wrath and random manglings, the gashing of heads and brains blown out over the river as the body seeks to escape. It must be rape so regular as to be industrial. There is no uplifting way to say this. I have no praise anthems nor old spirituals. The spirit and the soul are the body and the brain, which are destructible. That is precisely why they are so precious. And the soul did not escape. The spirit did not steal away on gospel wings. This is really powerful and troubling to me, because not just the sheer physicality of the language, but also because he confronts one of the most ingrained and powerful assumptions of the Black intellectual tradition, that the spiritual freedom of the mind is morally prior to the physical freedom of the body. So as an example of this way of thinking, I would cite here the Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, who I think his most famous idea is probably best known to us through Bob Marley's lyric in Redemption song, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind." Garvey goes on to add, "Mind is your only ruler, your only sovereign." So for Garvey and for Marley, right, one can attain sovereign mastery of the self in the realm of the mind, even as the body remains enchained. And likewise, I should say this extends also to Martin Luther King Jr.'s notion of spiritual freedom that really lies at the foundation of nonviolent resistance. In the passage that I cited above, Coates challenges both of these understandings of spiritual freedom by rejecting this distinction between the spirit or the mind and the body. If the soul can't steal away on gospel wings while the body remains enchained, then freedom begins and ends with a struggle against Black disembodiment. Freedom can't be achieved by liberating the mind from mental slavery without also liberating the Black body from the threat and terror of plunder. But I think it's important to note here that Coates doesn't simply seek to revive a liberal notion of freedom by regaining, sovereign mastery or sovereign control over and against the arbitrary power of the American police state. He says that, quote, "And I felt in this a cosmic injustice, a profound cruelty, which infused an abiding, irrepressible desire to unshackle my body and achieve the velocity of escape." To unshackle my body and achieve the velocity of escape. Freedom in this rendering is not a static condition, not a set of rights that one just possesses, right? It's a state of flight, a state of escape. It's an action or a verb rather than a noun, right? The act of unshackling, the act of escape. Coates goes on to say, these are the preferences of the universe. Verbs over nouns, actions over states, struggle over hope. Freedom for Coates is an embodied practice of struggle and resistance. Thanks.
During the 1890s, a French Jewish military officer in the French army, Alfred Dreyfus, was accused, convicted, and then pardoned for treason. The Dreyfus affair roiled France for nearly a decade with waves of popular anti-Semitism and reactions to it, or against it. Emile Durkheim, a French sociologist of religion, saw the Dreyfus affair as emblematic of the surging power of affective investiture in particular constitutions of the modern French imaginary. More simply put, who belongs and who does not belong. And he said this was symbolically played out in the representations of and fate of one man. Durkheim suggested that a diverse modern nation state required an affectively sacralized concept, or cult, if you will, of the individual citizen that would guarantee a coherent whole to which all belonged. What I'm going to do in this paper is I'm going to take this Durkheimian trope of the citizen and think about it as what is at stake in the conflicts of regimes of power and the hegemonic racial codes that were deployed during the summer of 2014, beginning in Ferguson, Missouri. And sort of this paper started with me thinking about being actually just sort of, in some sense, being sort of overwhelmed by the affective intensity and texture of the Ferguson Street events. In particular, what to me, from a digital remove, looked like anguished, enraged protesters screaming, "Hands up, don't shoot." And one in particular, a white police officer, some of you may remember this, screaming, "You fucking animals. Come on, you fucking animals." My default methodology in religious studies is social rhetorical analysis or discourse analysis. And if I were going to approach this in my usual way, I would talk about the dehumanized and naturalizing of black political anger as the essence of something barbaric and uncivilized. And I would talk about that discourse as being causative. I want to reverse it here, and this is exploratory on my part. And reverse it and think about the events of Ferguson and after from the ground up. Not so much asking first about what's being said, but how what is being said, discourse, imaginary, symbolic representation, my usual primary text, what all of that is related to or perhaps born of the material, emotionally charged activity of bodies in focused attention. Another way to put that, I'm interested in the way that affect can be politically generative. How does the materiality of Ferguson and after, or the collective effervescence, to go back to Durkheim's famous phrase, talking about emotionally charged crowds, evoke or provoke the symbolic narrative and the electrifying distinction between sacred and profane? Again, who belongs and who is seen as a pollutant. I know I'm using a binary here, and afterwards I would be happy to talk about why I'm still utilizing that Durkheimian binary, as problematic as it may be. Okay, and also another thing that sort of provoked this paper for me was my own emotional reaction. I found myself watching it from a remove, to use my grandfather's phrase, all bowed up. And transfixed by the spectacle. So I was also asking, what does the digitalization of the violence and the event do for the transmission of collective affect? And in this paper, I'm going to focus primarily on the street politics and the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. At the end, if I have some time, I'd like to look at a response to that. Okay, but before I begin, let me say a word about my terminology. In recent years, I've snuffled my way into neo-materialist and affect theory, and I found them to be very fruitful tools in analyzing the sacralization of social events and assemblages, or the inverse, social events that function to excise people who are considered pollutants through violence. So in this paper, I'm going to be referring to the term sacred as a historically contingent, cultural, sociologically built valuation of any collectively identified object, symbol, person, idea, or community. The profane, or profanation, I would suggest, is any of the above understood as pollution of the sacred. As Gordon Lynch, a sociologist, suggests, the word sacred is, quote, not a universal ontological structure within the human person or the cosmos, but rather reflects, quote, the nature and significance of what people take to be absolute normative realities that exert claims on the conduct of social life. This echoes Durkheim's claim that any object can be rendered sacralized or profaned through collective affective investiture. To put this in the terms of Sarah Ahmed, who is a British affect theory and queer theorist, sacred and profane, in some sense, or sort of point to the affective aura that sticks to certain objects or persons. Okay. So the emotional dynamism and political power of Ferguson and after is fueled perhaps by anxiety and anger regarding the ongoing and lethal denial of full participation in the imagined national assemblage. What is in such effectively and hence corporeal charged contention, I would suggest, is the racial constitution of the sacralized symbolic placeholder of social identity in America, the citizen. So I hope to think through some of the currents of collective effervescence from which social endeavors of sacralization and its menacing twin from the uncanny valley, profanation, emerge. Both the Ferguson and after street events, and if I have time, this was not in my abstract, but I just can't resist. The Trump rallies. I would suggest that both of these are different poles of an affective body politics on the contested boundaries of the American assemblage in transition demographically. So, so I'm talking about two American publics here, two demographics, and I've struggled with how to talk about this. Let's call one multi-American. The imaginary is pluralistic, even if it does not actually always get there. So inclusivist, and then what I would call an exclusivist American public whose social imaginary is distinctively not pluralistic. And again, I'm happy to talk about that binarism later on. Okay, so the killing of Michael Brown, an 18-year-old unarmed black man by a white police officer, politically galvanizes the mostly African-American residents of Ferguson, Missouri, and multi-American public into political street protests that sweep the country and that move out beyond Ferguson. The Black Lives Matter movement is born out of intense collective rage and sorrow that is furthered, I would suggest, by national consumption of the events at a digital remove. Added to this is the plethora of digital recordings of mostly black men and boys being killed by mostly white police officers. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott are just a few of these. In addition, post-Ferguson, there are digital recordings of black people being pulled over and detained by mostly white officers for driving or walking while black. And the hits just keep on coming, echoing and giving visual evidence to the entire nation of centuries of African American experience of brutalization by white police forces, in this case now hopped up on mil-spec armaments, and usually with legal impunity. Eric Garner's last words, as he's struggling to breathe, a bodily response to being deprived of air that he shares with any fauna that has ever lived on this planet, reflect a corporeal fact that he's suffocating, but a corporeal fact that opens onto the historical and ongoing collective truth for African Americans and people of color in relationship to police forces here. What's the relationship of this flesh and blood, these flesh and blood black bodies and public street politics that spring up in response? I'd argue that the connection is mediated by effective investiture of the murdered black body as representative of the collective belonging denied. Harassed and murdered black bodies evoke anger, sorrow, and rage because they function as symbolic sites or vectors of belonging betrayed, citizenship revoked. Sarah Ahmed again suggests, and I'm paraphrasing here, the most dangerous thing to a physical body is to be deemed a foreign body by the social collective. Over and over again, in the form of nationwide policing through racial profiling, black bodies, human beings, are deemed foreign and dangerous in the land of their birth. As dead boys and men, they do tell tales of de facto exclusion from the sacralized American imaginary. They represent not just the corporeal danger that attends being a black male in contemporary America, but also their murdered bodies become communal totems, symbols that speak to the ongoing exclusion of people of color in the national social body as citizen. As they are circulated, discursively and digitally in Ferguson and after, the affective power attached to them grows. The transgression of bodily integrity and the trail of collective belonging occur, and this desecration is usually with complete legal impunity. Their basic civil rights and their personhood are profaned. But black people are harassed and shot and killed by police forces day in, day out, year upon year, decades upon decades in the United States. So what is it about Michael Brown's killing that provokes these collective events? Again, this is a rumination. To help think this through, I've looked at affect theorist Teresa Brennan, who suggests that the atmosphere of a communal setting is a, quote, profoundly social thing, obviously, but meaning that its dynamic is precisely because affect is in motion between people. Affect is highly transmissible through the intensity and physicality of bodies together, and a la Durkheim, the shared focus on a symbol that signifies collective self-representation. She calls this process entrainment, and it helps explain the volatility and lightning speed of mobilization of a focused crowd. Referring again to Durkheim, I would argue that it's the transmissible affect of enraged or enthralled bodies in collective concert that sets the discursive narration of the event's meaning in motion. Analysis of crowd and police dynamics in those early weeks of Ferguson suggest the bodily enactment of affects of rage, humiliation, and betrayal of collective belonging. That is what triggers or fuels the political discourse and the rapid mobilization of street events. As more charged bodies arrive on the street, the affects and the discourse that bears them into cognitive awareness ramp up. In Ferguson in particular, the affective amplification is heightened in the face of the very system of power that killed Michael Brown, a historically hostile, prolifically racial profiling, and now militarily armed police force. The crowd gathering and milling in unfocused anger and protest at yet another killing is met with a large contingent of poorly coordinated and angry police officers bearing high-caliber assault rifles, armor, and tanks. The police also display the material marks of power that attend carrying such lethal gear and having the license to use it. Coded as foreign, animal, and criminal in the discourse and practices of that police force, the community gathers in anger, sorrow, and protest of the social order in which the killing of mostly black men and boys by the police is normative and has most often occurred without legal consequences for the shooter. All of the material conditions and the racist discourse that attends and supports that social order are arrayed on the streets of Ferguson with weapons made for combat against insurgents and foreign enemies trained on the community. But a funny thing happens on the way to the riot. After a spasmodic first week of collective affects veering into undifferentiated violence, the Ferguson protests coalesced into the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. Through physical, on-site transmission and digital entrainment nationally, a social collective is born of the circulation of effective gusts. As it draws numbers, it begins to function, I would suggest, as a counterpublic, a new sacralized assemblage that bears a totemic symbol of its founding, Michael Brown's body. And the collective ritual chant, hands up, don't shoot, that demarcates the sacred site of black life and citizenship being profaned. Okay, how much time do I have?
Out.
A minute or two. I'm out? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, okay, Trump rallies. I would argue.
Actually, we're doing really well.
Okay. The summer of 2014, 2015, I looked it over Black Lives Matter, Edie Windsor SCOTUS ruling, the white supremacist terrorism in Charleston, and the powerful national response to that, probably Obama's greatest bit of rhetoric. And I thought this has been a bad year for right-wing bigots. And then the Trump rallies come. I would suggest that in large measure, the Trump rallies are in part at least a reaction to these progressive movements in our nation. And I'll argue that they are largely, in large measure, racially motivated and coded. The demographic shifts causing deep anxiety that the identity of the, quote, authentic American is no longer necessarily marked by whiteness and Christian affiliation. And I think what you see is anger about the ownership of the symbolic ownership of American identity and how it is being, back to Durkheim, contaminated, polluted with color. Yes, I do recognize that there are class issues motivating the support for Trump, that they are indeed responding to economic decline. But even this long-term trend, which is from the effects of in-stage global capitalism exacerbated by corporate deregulation, in their words, is almost always racially coded. Thanks, Obama. A black man named Hussein in the White House contending with people of, so these folks now at the Trump rallies are contending with people of color as their president, as someone who in their job might have status over them. And like the Black Lives Matter movement, Trump rallies, I would suggest, are an exercise in the battles over symbolic boundaries of the social collective. The whole notion of the wall with Mexico, I would suggest, is an idea about material policy imitating the originating affect, which is fear of a porous border. Okay. But the affects at the Trump rallies are very different. Yes, there's rage, but this rage I don't think has to do with not being included in the social imaginary, but rather having to share the social imaginary. The very presence of so many people of color, non-Christians, queers, especially GBLTQ, people being granted civil rights, a black president again, seems like a threat to quote-unquote their nation. There was this South Park episode that keeps coming to my head. It's the one where they go to a water park, and Eric Cartman, wanders through the water park singing a lament about black people being everywhere. In other words, the loss of exclusively white public space. Okay, briefly, what you see at Trump rallies, I would say, are affects of mob. And again, the anger is not an injustice, but rage that the order of things is altering beneath their feet. Envy, jealousy, covetousness, belligerence are the affects that I would suggest are almost tangible at those rallies. And the rage is accompanied by one of the most, I would say, primal to the marrow affects, bodily affects, which is disgust. Right? Disgust for interlopers, insurgents, illegals, thugs, the new N-word, who threaten to usurp their ownership of the American imaginary. Meanwhile, any expression of anger by African Americans is pegged with the new N-word, thug, and they are essentialized as criminal and barbarous. So affects of fear and disgust bespeak, I think, an ongoing mythologization in white America of black-skinned people as sexual deviants, inherently criminal, you fucking animals, and in dire need of hard-nosed policing. Right, and being securely blockaded from white culture and civilization. So I guess my last comment on Trump rallies and what is going on there, which I suspect would be going on even without Trump. Right, what is interesting and frightens me is what lies beneath that. But what you see at these rallies, I would suggest, is a white temper tantrum at having to share.
So just in an attempt to give everybody kind of the most effective feedback possible, we thought maybe we would sort of quickly run through a couple comments and questions, and then let you guys post some comments and questions, and then let them respond after that to whichever of these they sort of want to, just so that they can kind of collect thoughts without using up too much time and hear from everybody.
You can go first.
Okay, so I'll just very quickly make a couple comments on each paper. So first, I think that you guys' paper is really intriguing, and I haven't thought as much about sort of the connection between these two concepts, these two sort of forms of degradation, I guess. And I think that the main question that I would be curious to hear more about from you guys relates to how we can see this idea in our current discourse, both about sort of environment and about race. And I think this idea of order to chaos, you can even see that in sort of the other two papers that were presented as part of this panel, frankly, Trump rallies, right? It's about protecting the body politic. It's about protecting some identity that is becoming chaotic. And so it seems to me that these are themes that are very relevant in current discourse as well. And so I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about that. For Adam, Also, I think considering how these ideas come up in public discourse, and particularly Coates's argument that essentially they don't, that sort of liberalism lacks the language to talk about this. As someone who looks a lot at this language, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts about how we make that different. And also as somebody who maybe has tried to engage with these ideas with students, as we all are very sort of often want to do, what is the language that we use? What are the evocative ideas, images, theories, concepts that can help to make this more tangible for people for whom this might be completely outside their experience? And then finally for Tam, I could say a lot about my thoughts about Trump rallies. I'll hesitate and save that for later conversations. But I think the two questions that I had related to your paper, first is about how these different symbols, so for example, the symbol of murdered and harassed Black bodies, these videos that are being transmitted across the internet, across the world, how are these symbols being received differently by people of color and whites in these two Americas that you've sort of defined, this like inclusivist and this exclusivist America? Because obviously in 15 minutes you don't have time to talk about all of these different permutations, but I think that thinking about how the symbols are being received differently is really important, because for people of color this is much more a lived experience, not a shock, right? Whereas for I think a lot of whites it is more of a shock, and so how do we understand the different affect that this is then producing? And then also I'll just say there's a lot of research in political psychology about how racial cues in politics are only supposed to work if they're implicit, because we're supposed to have this sort of social norm of racial equality such that when people make a racial coded appeal that's too explicitly racial, everybody's sort of supposed to say like, oh no, that's terrible and I'm not prejudiced, and it kind of can backfire. But obviously, at least for some small portion of the population, this isn't happening in the very explicit racial discourse coming out of the Trump campaign and other discourse. And I wonder if there's a connection between the events in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement, and this increasing acceptance of explicit racial cues. Because it seems to me that maybe in an environment where there's this social norm of not talking about race explicitly, the fact that there's hashtag Black Lives Matter and people are saying black and race and talking about these concepts and seeing these bodies discussed in a racialized way, maybe that has opened the door for people to feel more comfortable accepting even an explicit racial cue that otherwise they would have had to sort of reject in order to not seem prejudiced. Maybe it's kind of allowed for that. And so that gets back to this idea of how these different bodies and these images are being received by different communities. Okay, that's all I'll say.
I love the way that this panel came together around a lot of issues, particularly issues that I've been working on myself, so I thank you guys very much. First of all, the moment that we're talking about, I think is really important. What is it that brings this particular coalescence together? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and in two different ways. Why did in 2014 this catch on in the way that it did? And also, is it going to last? Because my sense, honestly, is that as a historian, it's not going to last, right? What is it going to mean when all of this energy kind of dissipates? I say that, and I guess I'll hold off on why I'm explaining that. Just okay. However, so a couple of thoughts on this. First, there seems to be a generalized focus on bodies in our popular culture, and I mean this both in the Kim Kardashian sense, but also the ISIS sense, where literally disembodying. So it seems like many different groups are jumping on this moment, which focuses on bodies in one way or another. Okay, moving on to embodied practice, which I really think would be a good way of thinking through the first paper as well. So embodied practice for you guys, the slaves themselves working the land. I mean, that seems to me the intersection of the two things that you're doing. And as a historian, of this stuff, as Matthew knows, I mean, we need to give the slaves back some of their, let's call it agency now, right? In the sense of them owning that landscape and providing African cultural practices, which they're incorporating into the landscape. I'm also curious why you describe these landscapes as degraded. That's kind of a iffy term, I guess you could say, as far as this goes. And I especially think of these South Carolina rice plantations, which are not, I mean, that's a reconstruction of some kind of naturalized landscape. Finally, the Baptist, right? I read a review of that book where he describes profit seeking as an embodied practice, right? That there's a sense of owning women, but seeking a profit as a very, so I think thinking through the notion of embodiment would be very useful for you guys as a way of tying this.
Right?
Sorry?
Not the economist?
No.
Okay, cool.
A much more praiseworthy review. And then finally, for all of you guys, but especially the latter two, the distinction I draw actually more and more is an urban-rural distinction. And I represent Obama as our first urban president in a long time. Because if you think about Reagan, the first Bush, the second Bush, they're all of Texas, right? They're all of California, they're ranchers. But here comes Obama from Chicago. And so the anger I see at Trump rallies, the anger from the Black Lives Movement, to me has much more to do with the second part of America, the rural, suburban, white community falling behind urbanness and urban values and cosmopolitanness. And that finally brings me, I think, to my last point, which is streets, right? So Coates mentions streets as the site of danger, but you guys are talking about the plantation as the site of danger. And where did that transition happen for us? And okay, last thing, let's bring this back to Sewanee. I mean, thinking about our police force as how would they identify someone walking down the street as aberrant, right? And I think it would have more to do, if they see an urban black male, they're going to assume that they're a student. Mm-hmm. So to me, it comes back to class, right? That they're looking for people who look like they're from, quote unquote, the surrounding communities as potential troublemakers. But I will leave it there, and I hope to open up to the floor for questions. And if not, please jump in.
Well, I guess I could respond to what I heard from both of you. Thank you, Melody and Roger, very much. And I think, down to the present day, certainly the language of animals, of whether engaged in copulation or not, is certainly has a long history with reference to black bodies, as Cam has mentioned. Goes back to at least the 1650s, kind of creating this idea of the black body as naturally disordered, and yet somehow at the same time perfect for labor if only it can be properly ordered. And of course, white people are the people to do that, as well as to bring order to this therefore empty landscape. So they have it pictured, so they have it imagined, of course, right? So there's a sense, and I think it's still very much with us today. White brings order to non-white chaos, as it were. And I mean, the ironic thing, I've not heard of the story from the Washington Post journalist that Russell mentioned before we kind of compared notes as we were creating this paper. And it occurred to me as you were telling the story just now that the 94 genocide that he mentions in Rwanda, right? And the fact of all these people, 800,000 people being killed over this perceived ethnic difference. Anyone who's seen Hotel Rwanda, of course, probably most of you, can tell you where that perception of ethnic difference came from. And that is, of course, colonizers from Europe and a measurement of body, of nose width. Yeah. And that right there was what goes so far to create the chaos that this African-American journalist at this point is recoiling from and saying, well, thank God I'm American. So there's all kinds of layers of irony there, I think, for us to work through. They've been building up for a very long time, these layers of irony.
There's an important kind of recent idea in the environmental sciences that actually come out of something that you've been working on as well. So Matthew's got is it going to be a paper, the roots of modern capitalism? Matthew presented a talk on campus recently called Slavery, Roots of Modern Capitalism. I think there may have been a question mark.
It's really not a while, but it does kind of speak into some questions that are very, very big in business history and economic history today.
I like that because it kind of explains the trajectory that Melody was getting at with her question about where is this found in the modern era. You've heard of the term Anthropocene. I think those of you that are reading the earth sciences, the new geologic era in which human effect on the environment is the dominant characteristic. Some more recent environmental scientists have actually been questioning that designation and have proposed an alternate name for the current geologic era, which is Capitalocene. And I think that does a better job of specifying the anthropos who are actually behind the geologic disturbance. So obviously that doesn't stop at the land, it affects the inhabitants of the land as well. And I think that explains kind of the trajectory from the era of slavery, which, as Matthew argued, produced modern capitalism, and now kind of reflects us back on to support itself.
If I could respond to too many questions. Great question. Let me just do a quick run through. In terms of how these images, say, of street protests have been received by, let's call it the exclusivist white or rural white population, I think in large measure is Schadenfreude. And how I know this is I track certain websites. I also am a white Southerner and have relatives who live in that world and who think in that world, and I'm constantly sort of asking them what they're seeing. And what they're seeing is black on black crime, right? They see a conflagration, and for them it is visual proof of how they perceive African American people of color. If they're inclined that way, I would say. And I don't know for the African American community, I would imagine that it has to be trauma, right? So what an ongoing trauma. And again, just sort of knowledge of a very, very old social pattern that has not gone away. The digitalization, I don't know. The digitalization entrains people differently, I guess. And Roger, to get to your question about urban and rural, I think that makes sense. It makes sense to me because I live here, but the American rural landscape is so profoundly depopulated. Right? Most of us just don't live there. And I think a lot of, say, the Trump rally rage that you're getting isn't necessarily just rural whites. It's also suburban and even some urban whites. So I guess I see those geographical, racial, and class things intersecting in whites there.
Yeah. Jordan.
Oh, okay. So something that Roger brought up, I think, in some ways ties these together in some ways that I was having difficulty with, has to do with what we might get from thinking about issues of streets, modern streets, urban streets, plantations, and it has to do with issues of dehumanization as a process of anonymity being a key feature of what's happening. So I think of the modern issues we're seeing, with racism and police brutality and things like that, and the degree to which when in crowds, when in masses, when our identity is not salient, we get away with this sort of collective effervescence that is, whether it is rooted in something we really desire or if it is some sort of outlet, it erupts in these circumstances. And we see it in cities, but it could also occur on slave plantations where there is anonymity, where there is no accountability for people's actions, right? No one was videotaping these things. And in my mind, I think, well, maybe what is needed is greater surveillance, less anonymity. And what do we think about these ideas?
I think that we can dehumanize other human beings without anonymity. I think anonymity helps. Right? Let's go back to Camus. Right? He talks about the dangers of abstraction, right? Thinking about human beings in abstract, objectifying ways. It makes it a lot easier to do whatever you want to do with them physically. More surveillance? I don't know. I'm so uncomfortable going out and about and knowing that I'm being surveilled. Yeah, I don't know. Good question.
Well, I mean, we could also think about the idea of requiring police officers to wear cameras on their body, for example.
So my take on that is, I mean, most of the evidence that I understand that is coming out about this just objectively, the body cam doesn't actually do anything. At least as far as I know, it's probably too early to tell completely, but I mean, I don't know about surveillance. I think for me now at this point, it's about fundamentally rethinking the role of policing in our society, and anything short of that just isn't going to go anywhere. And to respond to your question, Roger, about why at this moment, for me, it's this moment, what Mark said is we're at a point now with the Black Lives Matter movement where I think the civil rights movement and the civil rights way of framing racial inequality in this country has reached its limits. And I don't think we can solve these problems within a framing of civil rights. And the other reason at this moment where I hope it doesn't peter out, and I don't think it's going to, is because the systematic nature of these murders is becoming to the point where actually certain key aspects of American government are losing legitimacy in a fundamental way. Like, I can teach my students John Locke and social contract theory that when government no longer protects the rights of those subjects, they have the right to revolt. And they can see that, right? They can know that. It's that simple. And so I think that, so that's why I think I'm a little skeptical of the surveillance idea and the sort of simple idea that let's reform the police in this way. I think there's something more radical.
I'll just respond to that quickly. I mean, it occurs to me that we're of that generation, right? I mean, I don't know how old you are, but like we grew up with a generation that expected to outlive race, and that here it is again. And my experience in South Africa, we're 20 years out from the end of apartheid, and race is still very, so I think we're at this moment where race has come back in a big way. We couldn't have done a project on race maybe 10 years ago in an academic sense. I think it's fascinating, and a lot of the work is about, in the effective sense, what is it that drives this to keep coming back to us, right? And that's ultimately what we're all talking about, is the iterations through the centuries even of very similar types of practices and beliefs
But now
and
we
effective
have
relationships.
surveillance of cell phone cameras.
Right.
And
And there's the whole
videos we can
social
watch.
media. Russell.
Yeah,
I'll just point out that there have been several instances of police brutality, including murders, that were surveilled, that did not have any sort of justice outcome. So maybe more, it might tip the odds a bit, but it's certainly not a fail-safe. It's a provocative idea.
And I mean, the usual appeal, right, is an appeal to the conditions of policing, the conditions imposed on the police by these neighborhoods which they have to patrol. That's the usual appeal, yeah? How good, even if we see this happening in front of us, there's got to be some good reason why they did it, yeah?
Well, we did see it. I mean, going back to Rodney King, we saw it videotaped, and you know how that turned out.
Yeah.
I hope to disagree. I hope Adam is wrong on the issue of the sort of civil rights, sort of the language of civil rights sort of meeting its end, and that might simply be from my age and where I'm from. I grew up 20 miles away from the Martin Luther King neighborhood, so I'm attached to that. But I do agree, and I agree with your discussion of a sort of a breakdown in governmental agencies, right? And why is this happening now? Right? I don't think that the movement, the swell that is underneath Trump came out of nowhere, right? That came out of, I would say, decades of deliberate, what my dad used to call core mouthing of government, right? And putting people in office who are explicitly hostile to government, to quote unquote big government. And so you end up getting this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. You put people in charge who then sort of undercut the function.
Let's say that my point about civil rights is I think, and I don't mean that as just sort of saying that any sort of problem or idea that emerged during the civil rights era is wrong, but the specific framing of racial equality or inequality in terms of civil rights, right? I mean, so I taught Malcolm X today, right? And he says it's about human rights. It's about appealing to the international community. And indeed, Amnesty International has come out with a report that said every of the 50 states, in fact, has rules governing the use of lethal force by police that are out of sort of consistency with basic standards of human rights. I think that's kind of like what I'm getting at, is that the appeal to the government here, there's some way in which that's just not all it can be. There has to be this kind of higher, like, internationalist aspect to it, I think, is sort of what I'm thinking. And so for me, it's partially, to some extent, reviving. I think there's a promise in maybe reviving some of the arguments of black nationalists about talking about these issues. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where I'm coming from about that.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, so, I mean, but if you're talking about some kind of like international, I don't know, governance or intervention on some level in these issues, aren't you back into kind of the liberal sovereignty that you were trying to kind of critique earlier?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, but I would say actually no, right? Because then you're saying in that you're actually undercutting then, or at least state sovereignty, right? In some sense, right? You're making an appeal to the international community, right? And you're saying that on that basis, that I mean, I think this is actually really quite interesting, right? What would happen if we were to say that, in fact, the United States is a human rights abuser? Right? I mean, what would that look like?
For extremist white people in the United States who are actively advocating for RAHOWA, right?
Yeah.
Racial holy war, that I think an appeal to any sort of international body or international standard would sort of fit right into that sort of apocalyptic script that they had going on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I mean, I feel
That's
that
true.
far. I mean, you know, it is the international community, then by definition, they're already kind of outside, you know, them and everything that thinks, already outside this imaginary that you've so skillfully posited for us.
Well, and if you go to the Middle East, America's already seen as a human rights abuser. Right, that's not shocking
That's right,
language
yeah.
on any
Well,
level
yeah,
except
yeah.
for, right, to those of us in a protected
International
space.
sense, but when it's within the abuses are within the borders, right? Then
But even that's, I mean, so you taught, not next today, I taught about Brooklyn post 9/11 and disappearances of Muslims, right? It's only surprising language if our framework is Christian whites,
well, yeah.
right?
And interestingly enough, I taught about Enoch Powell, who might not be a familiar name to a lot of folks here, but British member of Parliament, 1968, says in Parliament that basically comes to as much as all these folks coming in from the Commonwealth, from all these nations that we used to rule, they can never be properly British, so we have to keep them out. Those who are already here should go back to where they're from. So definitely a theme. How do we all converge in this place at this point in April?
But I do think this is a valid point about liberalism, because liberalism is about individual autonomy, and I think appealing to, you know, at the whether it's at the national or the international level,
Yeah.
you know, it's back to the critique that you were talking
Yeah,
about in terms
I
of
see.
liberalism,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's also this other interesting point about that's embedded in the codes, and maybe I'm just thinking too much about my favorite word tomorrow and Africa, and I don't know, but you know, another critique of liberalism, not just about it being about the mind and the individual, the critique being that it's also the physical, which is what
Yeah.
you brought up, right? But that it's also the community versus the individual.
Yeah, back to
And I think the fact that he writes this letter to his son illustrates the community, right? I mean, it's the attention and the networks and that becomes also a critique to liberal individualism, and that, you know, I get to decide and I get to do because I'm this autonomous individual. So yeah, the physical matters, but also the community and where the physical fits within the community. Maybe,
Yeah.
again, maybe I'm projecting too much, because tomorrow I'm talking about people who are HIV positive who don't always think about the physical, but they think about the community.
Yeah.
So in terms of identity and mobilization.
No, that's actually really helpful. I've never thought of mapping that distinction onto these, because I mean, I think if you're talking about liberalism, another sort of antithesis of it is always right, the community.
Right, yeah, sure.
And I think
And again, I'm
that's the
struck
right-
that he writes this letter to Ken, right, to a son,
Yeah.
about the place in the community.
Yeah, and I would say, sorry, so hearing you talk, I actually realized I misunderstood your question, Brandon. So yeah, I think you're right. In some ways it is, then you are kind of backing into the sort of liberal protection of individual rights and individual sovereignty there. And I guess, yeah, I don't know, I'd have to think about that more, about what that means for my argument here. And it might be as simple as, I was hoping to understand Coates, and maybe I might not want to reject the liberal moment as much as maybe I was making myself out to in Coates, perhaps. But that's all I can say about that, because I'm not quite sure where to go with the question. But thanks for that.
I have a strange question that I'm playing with, but I'm wondering, Adam, you sort of said maybe we've reached the end of civil rights, and you guys have been meeting about. I'm wondering, and you used Trump as an example, but with different results, you could say that same idea of discuss could describe Bernie rally, right, feeling the burn, right, from a different angle, and that there's a way in which this idea of who's a I'm wondering if this is going to be really broad, but would you argue that we've reached the end of the nation state? That the nation is irrevocably fractured at this point in these two different ideas of what the community should look like, and now what, right? We've reached the end of civil, we've reached the end of an attempt to have a coherent nation, and then does that mean we've reached the end of an attempt to have a nation state?
I'll only say that in some ways I think yes, but I also don't know if I necessarily want to say that, because the last time somebody said that, like Hart Negri, then
Right.
you get Iraq. This aggressive
Right.
reassertion of nation state sovereignty in a very, I think, troubling way. So I don't know. I think so though. Yeah.
I don't think it's dead yet.
But would
Mine,
you
I think.
make the same arguments about the support systems? I mean, obviously with different things behind them, but the rallies of other presidential candidates? Or do you think that this creation of a new, or this dying grasp of a certain type of community is unique to Trump?
I might be wrong, I haven't been to any of the rallies, but it seems to me that at that tenor of the Trump rallies is rage, right? Ready to punch rage. I think there's some anger going on at Bernie's, but for the most part, it seems more sort of positively spun, right? And also there's the other thing about, what Bernie is attempting to do. He's making the argument on behalf of a revitalized nation, rather a revitalized state. And I think what Trump, at least the language, the rhetoric coming out of that is, from my perspective, thoroughly fascistic, right? And what do fascists do if they cannot have absolute power? They seek to throw a monkey wrench in the workings of power. So I think they're in different places. At the same time, maybe you're right. I'm having a hard time provoking. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I tend to think that I seem to see capital giving policy to government a lot more often than I see government giving policy to capital. And I think, in a sense, I see a lot of liking the critique of both the Trump campaign and the excitement around that, and the excitement around the Sanders campaign. Then, in a sense, they're both kind of united in that trying to get some sort of understanding and some critique of the way that's become, of the way that system's become, and just kind of being like the proverbial blind people who are feeling something, this animal that is the problem here, and the one side feels the tail of it and says, oh, it's the fault of the elephant, and the other side feels the ears and says, oh, it's the fault of the donkey.
Right. Do you think there was ever a time when capital wasn't controlling politics?
Well, based on what I study, it's hard for me to say that there ever wasn't a time like that, or at least not as far back as I go.
Or as far back as that?
How far back do you go?
Biblical.
Do you want to invite people over tomorrow?
I will say that it's 5:15.